The following is an interview at WCBS New York with Mordecai-Richler, the Canadian author. This was done on December 5th, 1983. I think the best way to start is to ask you, just give me kind of a nutshell about yourself and your background. I have a perspective of who you are and what you've done.
Well, I'm 52 years old. I come from a Jewish working class area in Montreal. I left Montreal when I was 19 and lived in Europe for 20-odd years, mostly in London. We were in London for 18 years. And we returned to Canada in 72, and I've been in Montreal ever since.
Why did you go to Europe? You went to England, isn't it?
Yeah, well, at the time, in the early 50s in Canada, it seemed if you wanted to write, you had to get out. It seemed like a very narrow and parochial society at that time. The standards weren't very high, and I felt if I was going to be a writer, I had to prove myself either in London or New York, and I chose London. And I was in Paris for 2 years before going to London. It was a marvelous time to be in Paris. There were a lot of American writers there on the GI Bill at that time. And ultimately, I decided I had to come back. I'd written about 5 or 6 novels, and I felt I could not write any more fiction in England, and I had to return to Canada.
The fiction that you wrote while you were living in London, did it have a Canadian, obviously it had a Canadian perspective, but your locales, your characters?
Yes and no. I mean, the last novel I wrote in London was a novel called St. Urban's Horseman, in which a very large chunk was set in London, and in which there were some British characters, but I was beginning to run into problems. Naipaul once put it very well. He said, I don't know what an Englishman does when he goes home at night. And unless you've been brought up in a society, and you know, I mean, very banal things that a novelist has to know, like the price of a haircut and who are the sports stars of the period and what the songs were and how people felt about things and what they ate. It's very difficult because you have to, research such things. They're not really important. But if you don't know them, you haven't got them at your fingertips, it's very difficult. Because after all, that's not really what fiction's about, but you have to have it at your disposal. And so I felt to stay on in England would mean to repeat myself, and so I returned to Canada.
That's an interesting comment. When you're writing about something in the past, even the recent past, you dredge up ideas and sensations in your mind, but specifics are very difficult. For example, say you're putting a novel set in the year 1962.
Yes.
How much was the price of gas?
That's right. You know, all these trivial or banal things, must be there, or you must know them. And then the other thing is that I found in London that I moved in a total literary society after a while, and that's very narrow and not really what writing is about. It was very good fun, but in Canada, I knew lawyers, I knew plumbers, I knew doctors, I knew insurance salesmen, and it was much more readily available to me as a total society.
When you were living in London, were you doing anything other than writing? Were you financing yourself with
Well,
writing?
no, I wrote. I had a very difficult time to begin with, and I didn't live in great style. But I published my first novel, I guess when I was about 21 or 22. I think I got a £100 advance. But then I began writing for the New Statesman and the Observer and British periodicals as well. And then I also did some film work after a while, and then I became a little more comfortable. But until my novels earned me a decent sum of money, I had to do a lot of other things, but they were all the nature of writing.
What was it like going back to Canada after 20 years as an expatriate?
Well, I had, that's a bit deceptive. I mean, I had been back in the last 10 years, at least once a year, usually managing some kind of magazine assignment or finding some excuse to go home. And then by that time, I should say, I was married and had 5 children. And we went back for a test year in 1968. I went to a university as a writer-in-residence just to see how the kids would adjust. And they had no problems at all. And I found, there I was at the age of, 41 or 42. I'd spent half my life in Europe, and I really hadn't traveled very much in America, so that was a joy. I did a lot of traveling here.
The kids had no problem adjusting to Canada, did you?
Not really, no. I think my wife would much prefer to still be in London. And I can't pretend that Montreal, has the things to offer that London does. But it is home.
You said that one of the reasons for leaving Canada was that you thought it was parochial. I don't know if you used the term provincial. It came through. What's it like now?
Well,
For a writer?
there's been a remarkable swing of the pendulum almost too far, in that we're now going through a period of cultural nationalism. If when I started out it was assumed that you couldn't possibly be a writer if you were a Canadian, now merely to be a Canadian makes you a writer. So there are a lot of inflated reputations there and a certain amount of nationalist cultural nonsense being talked. On the other hand, there are some very talented people. I mean, there's Robertson Davies and there's Alice Munro and Margaret Atwood and Margaret Lawrence. So there's some very good people about. So and the climate has changed, and there's some very reputable publishers and some good book pages in various publications, newspapers.